welcome to the channel, and in this episode we're going to be talking about Saruman and the Uruk-hai and Galadriel and her gifts.
Miri here for a recap of what we watched. We have Saruman preparing his Uruk-hai to hunt down the Fellowship. The elves prepare the Fellowship to leave Lothlorien. Galadriel presents them all with gifts. Galadriel also has a conversation with Aragorn about Arwen, and finally the Fellowship leave Lothlorien.
What are your thoughts about how the Orcs are created?
So the Orcs are created out of tortured and mutilated
Elves. Yeah.
Correct. And the Uruk-hai are a kind of superpowered version of them, created out of the swamp-like miasma. Well, firstly, on the Orcs and their creation, it's interesting that they're created out of torture and pain. In psychoanalytic language, what you'd say is that pain has then been introjected, to use the technical term, and used as a sort of resource by the Orcs to fuel them in turn, because their intent is inimical, hostile, combative in some way. So the pain hasn't been got over and expiated in some way. It's something they're still effectively still feeling or using to channel their inimical intent in some way. So that would be an interesting case of pain as introjected, because in a sense the torture has remained with them. They remain tortured as an ongoing epithet even after the event of the torture per se. They're not creatures having been tortured, they are tortured creatures. And there's I think a difference then between those two things, because it continues to be the condition of their being by the sound of it. So that's Orcs, right? Then we have the, what are they called again?
Uruk-hai.
Uruk-hai. And we saw at least one of them, didn't we, being generated in that spawn-like goo from an earlier episode. But apparently that wasn't the only one. There's one of a breed. And of course they're super warriors in some way. They are militarily powerful and all the rest of it. And no doubt there are associations there with this, with war and what's going to be the greatest weapon that can withstand the enemy's attacks and so on. Because they're almost like a organic form of tank or something. They seem indestructible, and there are loads of them. And obviously, you know, they're hideous swamp things that emerge from the deep. It made me wonder actually whether there was some connection, and maybe we've mentioned it before, between Ridley Scott's Alien film and the creation of these creatures, because they have a similar sort of sci-fi sliminess to them. Maybe, maybe not. But my main thought there was that they are going to go into battle with the Fellowship, or are being dispatched to kill the Fellowship, apart from the halfling, as he's called, Frodo, and the Ring, who is supposed to be unspoiled, to use Saruman's phrase.
I like that phrase.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting phrase, because there's something also to do with the general innocence of Frodo, which is at play there too. Possibly also sexual innocence, which isn't really a theme, but it sort of comes in around the edges, I think, a bit in all of this. Anyway, and just in brackets to say, although we are seeing Frodo evolve into being a man as a leader, he's not really taking on romantic attributes of any kind or sexual attributes of any kind. So he's a man and a kind of proto-warrior, perhaps, but he's anything but a romantic lead. I think if there is a romantic lead, it would be Aragorn, which we've touched on a bit before. Anyway, that's a sidebar, I think. What I was going to say is we've got the army of Uruk-hai, on the one hand, sent out to ambush and destroy excuse me, the Fellowship on the other hand. And that asymmetry, I think, is important, because the Uruk-hai are not differentiated. We don't have a small cast of characters. We have a large cast of undifferentiated soldiers. They're like stormtroopers, effectively.
Yeah.
And we know already from our film literacy, anybody who's seen films in more or less any epic genre, we know that hundreds of them are going to be slaughtered anyway. And that's part of the point of being in the army.
Yeah.
You're sent in as fodder. And though they're incredibly strong, we know they are also, by virtue of their sheer numbers, going to be sacrificed in great quantities.
Yeah.
So the number, I think, is important there. And the sheer volume of them that seem to be springing up, rather than being a sign of strength, is already implicitly a sign of weakness. Not within the film, because within the film they will be perceived as numerous and stronger as a result, but by virtue of the fact that we as viewers know what happens to lots of soldiers in films. A lot of them get killed.
Yeah.
They're extras.
Yeah.
In every sense, they're extra to the plot. They're extra as characters and so on. And that's what you sign up as when you become a soldier. And in the comments we've had quite a lot of references to the First World War and so on. And that's essentially what you are as a soldier. You are just one among others.
Yeah.
And when you become a soldier, you get a number. You're not identified so much by your name. You're identified by, name, rank, and serial number, of which number seems to be the most significant in a way. Whereas the Fellowship are very obviously finite in number, and they are a happy few. And I do think that phrase, a happy few, from Shakespeare, will have more or less explicitly been at the back of Tolkien's mind when conceiving of the Fellowship. This small band of brothers who are greater than the sum of their parts, as opposed to all of those Uruk-hai who are actually less than the sum of their parts, because they have the quality actually of mercenaries to me.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because although they've been fashioned by Saruman for his own purposes, and to that extent would be, highly loyal and faithful to his agenda, they seem to have the quality of this sort of mercenary.
Yeah, they look a bit more human than the orcs. Like, the physicality just looks a bit more human.
Yeah.
And they're also, like you were saying, when you become a soldier, you get a number. The Uruk-hai have got the hand of Saruman painted onto their face.
Which is interesting, because it doesn't seem that they would necessarily, maybe I'm wrong in this, maybe both things are true. Maybe on the one hand they are faithful to Saruman and are branded with his seal or ensign, and yet at the same time they do have this mercenary aura to them.
Yeah.
Like they're just a rent-a-mob or something.
So moving on to Galadriel, what are your thoughts on how she's presented in this scene?
Well, my feeling first of all is that this is going to be a farewell to Galadriel, just as it's her farewell to the Fellowship as they depart for the next stage of their journey. And that seems to fit with a broader idea that her appearance in the film is going to be fairly short and rare. Although she's a main character, one gets the sense that she's not going to be there the whole time. And it's been at least half the film until we've seen her. Yes, she's there as the narrative voice very early on in the opening part, but we don't see her until somewhere into the film. And the feeling is here, now that she has appeared, she's going to disappear. And that, I think, creates this idea of her presence being rare and special and precious, to use a word which I think is important throughout the films we said before. And I think that when we come then onto her giving gifts, that adds a sense of value to the gifts. And the sense of her value has also, I think, been reinforced, firstly through the ways we've already seen, because she has this ethereal, refulgent quality, but also because she seems to be a unique being. Nobody else in the film is quite like her, even of the same race as her. She seems to be preeminent in some way. She seems to be solitary, even though she's obviously connected with what's his name?
Celeborn.
Although she's connected with him, she seems to be with him but not with him at the same time. It's odd to think of her being married to him, actually, because she seems at a different time altogether. And the fact that she appears on this bark or boat in the shape of a swan, I think also suggests something a little bit solitary about her.
Because she's alone. She's not with her husband.
Yeah, she's alone. She's not with her husband. There's a slight reference to the notion of the swan song, which is this idea that when swans die, they go off on their own and they make their last kind of call by themselves before they expire. So there's all of that going on as well. Swan is a romantic image, but it's also a solitary image. She's a little bit of a black swan, ironically, insofar as she's this rare bird, rara avis. So all of that is going on. I think there's perhaps a reference to the crossing of the River of Styx when she's on that boat, which is the river to the underworld. I said in a previous episode that she reminds me of a goddess of the underworld, like Proserpina. There might be even a little hint of Eurydice in that as well, as in Orpheus and Eurydice. So there's, again, obviously a lot going on in all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about her being, the way that she's so special is that she's not really there. She's the main character, but what makes her so interesting is that she kind of appears, and it's almost like her being is too much to be there all the time. And if I was to compare that to the new Amazon series, where she's the main character and she's in every episode, and I think, I mean, I only watched the first series. I didn't get along with it, but the contrast in how they presented the character, it's interesting because I don't think you can have Galadriel, as a kind of character that's there all the time, because she's just not like other people. It's like, I don't want to see her being concerned with everyday things. I just want her to be up there, kind of being more of an overseer rather than the main kind of hero.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen that Amazon series, but that does seem an odd choice to have her there the whole time, because it's her specialness and rareness which defines her, and therefore it's appropriate that she only appears for a very finite amount of time in the film. It's almost like a flashlight on a watchtower or something. The light comes around very slowly. You're in its light just for a few minutes and then it passes on, or like the arrival of a rare star in the sky, which comes around every generation or eon or several thousand years.
Yeah.
She does have that quality to her, and I think it would be undermined if she was there the whole time.
Yeah.
And it would suck her in, as you say, into terrestrial concerns or everyday politics. And I think I said before, her husband Celeborn does seem to have a slightly more political quality to him, or earthly quality. He seems more in the world of negotiation. She seems to be of a different disposition altogether, which again is, to me, a surprise when you put those two together.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see what they talk about behind closed doors.
Yes, I'm sure they don't argue about who's done the washing up. Well, maybe they do, maybe he does. So I think all of that is in play with Galadriel there. The idea that she's there temporarily and it's special as a result. But we also have her in two other moments, don't we? We have her conversation with Aragorn, and we have the gift giving at the end.
Yeah. Should we talk about Aragorn first?
Yeah, so she has this conversation with Aragorn, not interestingly with Boromir, although Boromir is watching her at one point. So Galadriel is engaged with Frodo in particular. She gives gifts to the Fellowship, but her main interaction is in this section anyway, with Aragorn and then with Frodo, I suppose. With Aragorn, it's interesting that he is picked out.
Yeah.
And that Boromir is not picked out by her.
Yeah.
because although we've been sort of seeing the two of them becoming like a little alliance within an alliance, just about reaching kind of concord with one another, they're not quite equals in terms of the existential weight of the film, I suppose. Aragorn still seems to be a bit more related to the higher order of beings than Boromir is. And I think Galadriel choosing to speak to him suggests that as well.
Yeah.
That Aragorn is a bit more tuned into the higher purpose of things than Boromir still is.
Yeah, and you get the feeling that they've met before.
Yeah. And Galadriel says to me a very striking thing, which is a warning about the grace of Arwen diminishing, which I was a little bit shocked by. And I thought, well, okay, that must be because we have seen Arwen make this trade to become mortal in order to have the love of Aragorn. And I assume it's connected to that in that trade, in forfeiting her immortal elvish life, she has lost some grace or will lose some grace. And with that will come the ability to save or intervene on the part of Aragorn and the Fellowship. So her light will also diminish a little bit. Now, we don't think Galadriel's light is going to diminish, but it will become invisible. With Arwen, we're now being warned that in a way her light will actually diminish.
Yeah.
She will become less a creature of grace and more a creature of human time, anxiety, and all of these things which serve to undermine grace.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, going back then to that scene with Aragorn and Arwen, they're basically their kind of marriage vows almost earlier on. Aragorn is clearly bowled over by this choice that Arwen is making, but perhaps hasn't factored in what Galadriel is now telling him, which is, well, actually, in choosing to become mortal, she's actually going to become less special than the person you think you're becoming tied together with, because she's going to become more human. It's not just that she'll die, it's that she'll lose some of her grace in the process, which is a pretty heavy thing to hear. I mean, I don't think Aragorn is registering that necessarily.
Is he still going to like her if she's not an elf?
Well, to put it crudely, yes, because she has to become less special in order to be with him, and yet it's her specialness which makes him attracted to her in the first place. So it's a bit of a paradox or conundrum in some ways. I don't think that's necessarily how Aragorn is hearing what Galadriel is saying, but I do think it's an implication of what's there.
I think he hears it as she's dying.
I think he hears it as that too. I think he also hears it as she'll have less power to intervene and save you and the Fellowship, maybe, too. She'll be less of a resource to you as a group. But I don't think, and I'm speculating, I don't think he hears that as a undercutting or threat to his own feelings towards her, or his own idealization of her, actually, because the grace that she had or will have had is one of the key things that has drawn him towards her.
Yeah.
So although it's only a very brief moment there in the film, and I think, did you say just before we started filming that's not in the shortened version?
That's not in the theatrical cut.
It's interesting because it's quite a poignant moment, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe it was too much to have included. It's very, to me at least, very thought-provoking thought.
I mean, the film's pretty long, so they had to cut.
But that seems a particularly meaningful thing to have said. Yes, so we have that exchange with Galadriel and Aragorn, which I think is, to me, philosophically speaking, particularly interesting, and what the role of grace is. There's a wider point, I think, about grace in the film. We know from the comments we've had what a devout Christian Tolkien was. And there is a sense of grace here being that thing which will save people ultimately, is not just the gifts of Galadriel, the Mithril, and so on. It's as if there is a higher form of grace in the world which will be there literally as a saving grace. There will be some amazing grace to save these souls at work in this universe.
What is the definition of grace?
It's a big word. The Greek word charisma is often thought of as the origin of the word grace, but of course the English word charisma is nothing like the Greek word charisma. So that's one definition of grace. Grace is also related to, as in Spanish and French, gracias, or
Gracious and
being gracious. And the idea in all cases is that grace is something extra to what's required. So I can give you a drink of water, or I can give you a drink of water graciously. If I just give you a drink of water, you don't get any less water than I give you that drink of water with grace.
yeah.
But there's something about the grace, the extraness of it, which adds humanity, which adds warmth, which adds love, which adds respect to it all. And if in return you say thank you, gracias, you're saying something which isn't necessary. It's not required like a payment might be. So it's interesting if you go into a shop and you buy a bottle of water and the person behind the counter gives you the bottle of water, you might say thank you even though you've given the money.
Yeah.
So the thank you is unnecessary. And that's the important thing about grace. It's unnecessary, it's extra, it's supplementary, but it's precisely the extraness of it that creates its value, because you're moving from the sphere of transactional value into invaluable value, from the priceable to the priceless. And it's the pricelessness of grace which is key. And in this film, which is so much about the question of value and preciousness and so on, grace then becomes a key word, I think, because it's precisely about the unpriceable elements of life, things that can't be reduced to an economy or to a tariff in some form. And now, as we're coming to speak about the gifts, a similar thing applies, because the gifts are both useful and useless. Because they are both functional and beautiful at the same time, they raise this ancient question really about what the distinction between the two is. So the swords, for example, that are given, and Samwise says, oh, can't I have one of those shiny swords? Well, one of the reasons he wants a shiny sword is that it's shiny and lovely. It's an object in its own right. It's a work of art. It may or may not be useful in combat too. But like the notion of grace, there is this idea that you can build in elements to something functional which are also extra and beautiful and seem to have a value beyond their utility, which in a strange way has more use in the end than anything else. It's like in football matches, if the managers say we've got to play with belief, and you might think, well, hang on a minute, that's all very well playing with belief, but don't you also need to do your training exercises? But actually, increasingly, managers will say, well, belief is the thing that's going to win the game for us. It's the intangible extra that will be the motivator. And in a way, all those gifts that Arwen gives, that Galadriel gives, there is this question in each case: is this useful or beautiful? Is it both? And actually, will the beauty, the gracious element of it, and the graciousness of the giving of these things actually be the thing that in the end makes the difference? Not the cutting edge of the blade, or the light given off by the object, or the power of the rope that's been handed over. I mean, all of those things might have practical value in and of themselves, but their specialness lies partly in their beauty, and their beauty is a reflection of Galadriel and the graciousness of her intent in the giving of those things. So I think all of those questions are in play. There's a slightly more, let's call it, cynical view as well. In this, I'm thinking of Nietzsche's view of gifts. I mean, gifts are a big theme, particularly in anthropology. The most famous work of anthropology is Marcel Mauss's book on the gift, mid-20th century book, which spawned all sorts of other literature to do with the idea of exchange. I had a client the other day who was talking about the Lewis Hyde book, The Gift, which is written in that the spirit of the Marcel Mauss book. But gift giving and exchange is a key topic in anthropology. Anyway, in Nietzsche is very wary of gifts. He says, in fact, if you're given a gift, the first thing you need to do is to avenge the gift. That's his phrase. You must avenge the gift. And the reason is because once you're given a gift, you're in the debt of the person who's given it to you. So it's a gesture of power in Nietzsche's understanding. And it is a gesture of power in Galadriel. I mean, she comes across as beautiful, gracious, beatific in all sorts of ways. But we know that the Fellowship will feel in her debt as they carry forward. And it will serve, these gifts will serve as a reminder of her. They are artifacts of Galadriel. So although we were sort of agreeing on the fact that she appears only rarely, appears and then disappears, as though no trace of her remains, well, actually, these gifts are artifacts of Galadriel. They are legacies of Galadriel. They've got Galadriel inscribed throughout them. It's impossible to use them without using them in her memory or in the spirit of her in some way. So to that extent, everything that the Fellowship now does with the blessing of Galadriel, or even hereafter in the film, is done under the aegis in some way of her. And she has now become the counterbalancing power force to Sauron in the movie, if anybody has. But much more subtly, because she's done it through disappearance and trace rather than through appearance. Now, you could argue that actually thus far Sauron has only appeared as trace. He's only appeared as a visible, invisible, just as a mark, or through his deputies, particularly Saruman. And to that extent, he too is playing the game of visibility and invisibility. Galadriel's doing the same thing here. She's using her visibility in order to become then invisible, but to remain through these artifacts, which will be born almost like holy relics by the Fellowship as they continue their quest. So I think there is a power dynamic there. I mean, it may be unpalatable to say Galadriel is seeking to wield power over the Fellowship. It's not necessarily her intent, but I think it is an effect of what she does.
Might it be her way of help? I mean, it's obvious. It's an obvious thing to say. It's her way of helping. Yeah, I guess you're right. It's a way of her being always attached to them as they go on, without explicitly telling them that this is what she's doing. That is what she's doing, so that she can maybe, almost spy on them as they go on.
Yeah, I mean, she probably has the capacity to spy on them anyway, I'd have thought, if she has those telepathic gifts. But from this more Nietzschean perspective, that, from a pure power perspective, it's hard to argue with the fact that her power is continued through them and through these artifacts which she's given them, which have a slightly voodoo quality because they attach still to the essence of the person that they are removed from, but keep her in play in some way. So they are hers. She remains carried within them, and they're all terribly grateful for them. I mean, the way the Fellowship respond to the receipt of those gifts is respectful to the point of being obsequious. They're almost bowing down in honor, and so she's very much in a position of I was going to say lording it over them, ladying it over them, being a sovereign over them. And in turn, in her memory, she will become like a kind of saint, like a St. Christopher or something, that somebody who will guide their journey and be a spirit that they may invoke along the way. So I don't think there's any question of her stature being in any way impaired and probably enhanced by both disappearing but enabling these artifacts to bear her forward. And I think there's also the sense that, I've chosen these gifts specially for you because I have an insight into your character.
Yeah, because they are very specific.
They're very specific, as if to say, look, I've chosen this for you because I have insight into who you are, and this is matched perfectly. These aren't generic. I'm not giving you all the same thing. It's not like Christmas where I've got a job lot and, you're all going to get the same jumper. These are...
Well, they all get the same cloak.
Then they all get the same cloak, actually. They do get the same cloak with the ivy brooch and the ivy clasp, actually. And I was interested by the ivy. I think it is ivy, right, on the brooch.
It's a leaf.
But the leaf is an ivy leaf?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure.
I thought it was ivy, and if it is, that's interesting because ivy is obviously connoted with loyalty in some way, because it clings to walls and clings to trunks of trees. So I think it would be a symbol of loyalty and attachment. And again, that bears out the idea that they remain attached to her and they're her boys.
What did you think of the rope?
It made me think of Cluedo. The rope, the lead piping, the dagger. These are the things that you could commit a murder with.
Yeah.
It also reminded me a little bit of Mithril. There was something about the quality of it that reminded me a bit of that. It seemed to have
it's not your normal looking rope.
It wasn't your normal looking rope. I think in each case as well, there's a bit of an element of a puzzle. It's like you're given, these are the elements of the puzzle, then you have to guess the game for which they're used.
Yeah.
Or imagine a scenario in which all of these things come together, or you give an improvisation troupe 5 things, and now you have to weave a story out of it. And in that sense, she's literally giving them the elements of narrative. These are narrative components. Each of these things will have a role to play in the story.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like she's kind of she's encouraging them to follow a path with these gifts, with the gifts.
They're like clues as to what's to come. If I'm giving you a rope, it's because at some point you're going to need a rope. Is that going to be to climb out of a hole? Is it going to be to string a bridge across a ravine? Is it going to be to tie somebody up?
Yeah.
And so on. So I think it's interesting although they are artifacts of her memory, they are, as you say, kind of nuggets of narrative to come and clues as to the narrative to come without revealing anything necessarily ahead.
With Gimli, she doesn't give him a gift, but she asks him, "What do you want?" And it's an interesting dynamic because the elves and the dwarves have a bad relationship, so it's kind of like she's come along and almost healed the relationship just by her being.
Yeah, there's obviously some history there, and there's a very obvious opposition between the two. He's a hideously ugly man, and she's an outstandingly beautiful woman, and he asks, in response to her granting him a request, just to look at her, to be in visual receipt of such beauty. Because to him it's obviously a rare thing, and you can get that. It's a bit like Elephant Man or Beauty and the Beast or something like that. You do get that contrast between these two beings. And it's interesting because I would have thought, and as you know, I'm very interested in this practice called systemic constellations, which is all about acknowledging things as they are. I would have thought the greater gift actually for Gimli would be for her to look upon him and accept him, rather than him to get a chance to look at her, which is a little bit like, he's a teenage boy and is allowed to look at the beautiful woman, which is fine, but actually the more evolved thing would have been to say, please look at me and look at me as beautiful. That would have been...
Yeah, but I think to push back on that, he has been treated quite badly by a lot of elves around him. When he first meets Legolas, he's not that impressed, and when they come into the forest, the elves say, you know, the dwarf breathed so loudly we could have shot him in the dark. And when he does meet Galadriel, she treats him with respect. I don't know what she says to him telepathically, but he seems to cut just everything for him. He just relaxes in her presence. So I do feel like she
already
has
done that.
looked upon him as an equal, or you know, not as an enemy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe in a way, the more healing thing for him would have been just to say thank you to her for that.
So then, the gift she gives to Frodo, the most precious star, the light of, I'm going to say it wrong now, the light of Alendil, I think. Our most beloved star. I don't know why, it always really moves me when she gives that to him.
Oh, why is that?
I think the music just really gets big then, and the music just adds to it, and she says, oh, may it be a light to you in dark places when all of the lights go out.
Yes. Yes. And that did remind me again of this notion of saving grace or amazing grace. You know, though you walk through the shadow of the valley of death, I am at your side. So I thought there was a little bit of a reference to that there too.
I guess it's that idea of giving him something so precious for him to just carry around. It just reminds me of when I first started school, like when I was a little kid, and my mum was saying, like, I really hated going to school, and she said that she said, like, oh, don't be scared. I'll just remember I'm in your pocket. If you ever, when you get scared, just look in your pocket and I'm in your pocket. So it just kind of reminds me of that idea of Galadriel being always with Frodo within that star.
Yeah. And that goes back to the idea we talked about last time of the kind of spirit she is. She's a tutelary spirit. She is there for protection, really, ultimately.
Yeah.
And that micro star, in a way, is that emblem, isn't it? A star that lights the way from within.
And she gives it to him telepathically.
Mm.
Thank you very much for watching this episode, and an extra special thank you to our members. And please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and do those good things. And we will see you in the next one.